Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good late night. Welcome to today's talk from CISA, the Centre for India and South Asia at UCLA. My name is Anna Morecambe. I'm currently interim co-director of CISA, working with Akhil Gupta. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous people who have lived on the land on which UCLA is built for thousands of years and taken good, sustainable care of it. The Centre for India and South Asia, CISA at UCLA, acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Stavanger, the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands. As a land grant institution, we pay our respects to the Honuk Vetum, the ancestors, Ahihirum, the elders, and Eyu Hinkam, our relatives, relations, past, present, and emerging. So it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Aditya Pratap Deo here, and thank you so much for being here and to give this talk. I also want to say a big thank you to Jamaica Villegas, who has been doing all the admin for this very smoothly. So I'll just briefly introduce our speaker and then hand over. Aditya Pratap Deo teaches history at St. Stephen's College, Delhi in India, and he is zooming in from Delhi right now. He has his early degrees in history from the University of Delhi and a PhD in history from Emory University in the USA, Atlanta. His areas of academic interest and research are modern South Asian history, with special focus on tribal worlds, state formations, and Chhattisgarh, or Central India, and philosophies of critical theory in history and anthropological history. And he's published on all of these themes, and he's going to be talking about, well, giving a talk based on his new book, which relates to all of these things. So he will speak for some 45 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. There's a Q&A box you can put questions in, or you can just say, I have a question. So we'll deal with that then. We have a lovely audience, 56 participants, I'm sure, from across the world. So over to you, Aditya, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you very much. Good day to everybody. Since all of us are from different parts of the world, I will not say a greeting for each part of the day, but I'm really grateful that all of you could join us for this talk. One of my former students, friends, was telling me how this is such a wonderful opportunity where webinars now allow people from across continents to come together in academic meetings and assemblies and gatherings in a way that was not possible before. So, of course, the cost of the pandemic is very high. Nothing can really, compensate. But if something good has come out of it, I think it is one of these things. But it also comes with its own problems that since all of us are joining. So I'm really grateful to UCLA and CISA for inviting me for this talk, to Anna, to Jamaica, to Akhil, and to the entire community, scholarly community at UCLA. I'm also grateful to all my colleagues and students and friends who have joined from different parts of the world, especially those in India, for whom it is quite late in the night, actually. So also, I didn't want to sort of start before gesturing a little to and recognizing the fact that all of us have gone through such a difficult time. And having lived in the United States, I've always thought about and worried about my friends in Atlanta and elsewhere. So I hope that we are getting out of this blight, which seems to have completely derailed life, as it were, and cost so much in all sorts of ways in these last 2 years. So hopefully, this seminar is part of that step out and forward. And away and out of this terrible, terrible time. Let me get to the talk then. And if I may have your indulgence, I'll quickly pull out a presentation just in order that we be somewhat sort of grounded, as it were, in something that one can use as a template, a grid, I suppose. That so can you see the screen?
Yes.
Right.
I can certainly see.
Is it full screen?
Yes, it's looking perfect.
Right, excellent. Let me also just see if it moves, because yeah, so there it is. So this is the cover of the book, as I was telling Anna, of the South Asia edition, which is what I like, because the cover is actually done by a friend of mine. And as you see, it's much more evocative than, of course, the cover here, which is a standard template that Routledge, Taylor and Francis offer. So the trick is that at the moment, the South Asia edition is not yet out, but I hope that it will in the next 1 month or so. So we'll probably have this with us. In the background, you can see the palace in Kanke, about which this book is, and I will soon tell you a little about it. And in the front, you have the ancestral deities of the mixed tribe caste communities of Kanke, who are in fact the subject of this book. Now, this book is an attempt to explore the historical polity of Kanke, a colonial princely state in central India, through oral accounts given in the course of the ancestral deity practices of the mixed tribe caste communities of the region. So what I've done is that I have delved into the vast store of accounts given by these communities in the course of the ancestral deity practices, which are about the polity of Kanke, the historical polity of Kanke. Now, just to explain a few things, for those of you who might not be aware, where is Kanke? As you can see now on the map of India, Kanke is that black area in the middle of the present Indian state of Chhattisgarh. It's not quite central India, as you can see, but it's quite central. And historically, it's been part of various central sort of called things, like say the central provinces or the central states agency, or things like that. So it's fairly sort of central. The topography of Kanke is very interesting. It lies, as you can see, between various different important geographical landmarks of the subcontinent. Most importantly, the Vindhya and the Satpura hills here in the top, or just above where I've written Kanke here. Underneath, you have the Eastern Ghats. So it's a kind of area in between these two hilly, mountainous regions, and very thickly forested, one of the most densely forested areas of the Indian subcontinent, and historically also quite always like that. So even if when you look at, say, Irfan Habib's map of Mughal India, what you will find here is basically a blank area where he's probably written something like timber elephants. So, it's actually a very densely forested area of the country. And it is also the catchment of the river Mahanadi, one of the major rivers of India, which actually emerges in a place called Sihava in the territories of the old princely state of Kanke, and then flows northeastwards into what is modern day Orissa until it finally meets the Bay of Bengal in Orissa itself. So what you have here is really in Chhattisgarh, hills and mountains on the top, hills and mountains in the bottom here, and a riverine plain in the center. And Kanke straddles the area of transition between the lower hills and mountains and the plains areas of the river Mahanadi to the north. So it lies in some ways in the shatter zone between the hills and the mountains of the south and the river valley in the north. This is a map drawn by me of the princely state of Kanke. And of course, it locates Kanke within the present-day district of what is called Uttar Bastar Kanke or North Bastar Kanke. The princely state of Bastar, the better known and larger part of this area, was to the south of Kanke, and the territories of these two regions were contiguous. So what you can see here at the bottom are areas of the former princely state of Bastar, which are now part of the district of Kanke, and the upper smaller area, but more densely populated in relation to the northern areas of Bastar, is what used to be the princely state of Kanke. As you can see, it very much lies in this region of transition between the hills here in the south, and of course, the basin and valley of River Mahanadi to the north. Most of the geography of Kanke then is hill and forest, but also the plains areas in between. This is typically what a kind of open area in the region might look like. And there are lots of these very interesting sort of rock formations that dot the entire area. And in the background, you can see the gently rolling hills. In the foreground, you have the forests. These are, this is one view of the forest. These are the trees of the area. The forests are mixed deciduous, semi-tropical, and are never quite dry and without leaves at any point of the year. There is always something or the other flowering, fruiting, blooming at some point of the year. Interspersing this area of hills and forests are these plains. And in the south, of course, these are few and far between, and the hill and forest topography predominates. But as you go northwards, there is more of the plains area and less of the hill and the forest areas. These rock formations that dot the topography of Kanke often have or hide these prehistoric rock shelters, as the one that you can see here in the picture, where you can actually find prehistoric rock art. There are many, many such sites all around the town of Kanke and the area of Kanke. In fact, my joke is that one of the favorite pastimes of the people of Kanke is to go looking for these sites. The hills are easy to climb and you can always get on top. The bears and the leopards are not visible in the mornings. And so you can actually quite get to many of these and find and discover your own site. Unfortunately, increasing visits of peoples to these places is actually leading to degradation and spoiling. But I hope that good sense prevails on us and we manage to not just find, but also conserve these areas. This again, one such rock shelter. So basically, Kanke has had a very long history of human habitation. The River Mahanadi and its tributaries cut across the entire landscape and create these beautiful, as you can see, rills and streams and water and forest and hill range topography, which is really lovely actually. This is the River Mahanadi, very close to Kanke, just after it originates at Sihara and before it has become anything substantial like what it does actually as it moves along. This is the Sih Darwaza, or the ceremonial gate for the procession of the old princely state of Kanke, behind which one of the major palaces of the rulers is housed. Now it has been converted into a kacheri, a kind of courthouse, although the main courthouse is now moved out into a new complex further outside the town. This is the most recent palace of Kanke, where the rulers of Kanke have lived. There are 3 or 4 extant palaces, and this is the most recent. It used to actually be the house of the British resident. And then later on, of course, it was given away to the last ruler of Kanke, Pratap. These are the ancestral deities whose practices and the accounts in which practices I have looked at. As you can see, they have an interesting shape. Most of them are in the form of two rounded logs of wood joined in the middle by another or two, and they can be lifted up like this or hoisted up like this on the shoulders of their carriers. Of course, the belief is that once so hoisted up, they actually walk and move on their own. So this is not the standard type of ancestral deity. This is the highest form of it, called the Angadev. And there is a small discussion in the book about what really this Angadev literally also means and could actually represent. And I won't go into the details of that as yet. But there are all manners of ancestral deities, and they take a variety of forms, from very simple, small ancestral deities of particular persons and particular families to those of entire communities. In their highest and most superior form, they are the Angadevs, or what you can see in front of you. Now, like anybody else, I wanted to write the history of the place that I had come from, where I am from, Kanke. And it is when I wanted to do this that I actually had to recognize that it was not possible for me to do justice to my project until I actually looked at the ancestral deity practices of the peoples of Kanke. Because usually when one is writing a history of a place, one is looking for documents, written records. Here, what I was trying to access is a set of moving, living practices and accounts that were given in the course of those. So one needs to explain a little bit about why this sort of term came along. And here I'll just put out a set of postulates which help me get there. They are somewhat simplified, so please bear with me in that. Now, I believe that how we think of our past is greatly determined by what we want to do with our future. In the same way as how we think about and imagine our future actually determines the ways in which we look at our past. This is what I call vision. By vision, I mean the way in which we look at our world and the things that we want of it. These might look like two different things, how you understand your world and what you want your world to be. But actually, these are the same thing in the sense in which how you understand your world determines or decides really what you think your future should be like. And similarly, what you want your society to be often determines your understanding of where you are. In some senses, this is the same formulation that I put out first. And vision actually contains past, present, and future all together in that interesting sort of an inextricable compact. Now, when one, when you advocate and you attempt to make possible what you want your society to be or what you think your society is, then what you do is an act of politics. Politics is about wanting to make the world as you want it to be. And then, of course, to understand the world in the way in which you want. Now, history as a knowledge practice that deals with the way in which we see our past, and I've already said how they are related, I feel, to the present and the future, is a kind of advocacy of a vision of the past. And therefore, it is intrinsically political. We all have histories. And this is different from our understanding of the past once we get to the point of advocating or trying to make possible, then we enter the realm of the political. So, and that is the realm of history. So there are pasts and then there is history. History is that point when we move from just, sort of having and thinking about and sensing a past to a point of meaningfully ordering it in order to be able to understand how we are and what we should be. So, history is essentially the political of our understanding of the past. They are very, very closely, I feel, connected. Of course, all of us want to see our worlds in different kinds of ways, and we want our futures to be of different kinds. And therefore, there is always a large number of histories in the field. And of course, because we all make our lives together as society or societies, these pasts and these advocacies of the past, these histories are very, very deeply connected. So we live in a world in which there are a large number of histories or a large number of our understandings of who we are and what we want to be. And all of these are very, very closely connected. Now, over time, and especially in the modern period, I believe that one kind of history, a disciplinary history, has come to take pride of place and actually has established itself as the dominant way of envisioning ourselves, our presents, our pasts, and our futures. This is very closely connected to a large number of developments, and I won't labor the point. You're all familiar with it. The usual suspects are capitalism, colonialism, modernity, etc., etc. It's very closely connected to these developments, which mark and compose our times. And it accompanies and advocates that vision of the world. And it is an extremely powerful vision which has come to dominate most of the organized practice of history. Of course, there are a lot of kinds of histories within that also. I'm not for a moment suggesting that this is a monolith and there is no conversation within. But on the whole, a certain parameter has been set and it works within that. There are certain protocols, certain gatekeeping concepts that mind what kinds of histories will be practiced within this corpus, the system, the set, this complex, and what kind will not. So, for example, this kind of history admits of only that which is written. Then it is also a history that moves time in a linear fashion from the past to the present and then to the future. Of course, you will ask as to what other different kinds of combinations of these temporalities can there be, or can there be other ways of thinking about time, apart from, of course, the idea of the past, the present, and the future. And you will be surprised, and you probably already know that yes, there are many other ways of looking at time, but history looks at time in this particular fashion. Reason is the sine qua non, the indispensable condition of being of history. If there's something that is not reasonable, then of course it cannot be historical in this disciplinary, mainstream, dominant historical sense. It is very secular. It doesn't admit of what is faith and what is religion. It also considers an autonomous individual as its subject, and of course, proceeds from that. It does not think about, yes, it does think about communities, but it doesn't admit subjectivities that don't at least begin as autonomous subjectivities. Therefore, it is unitary. It doesn't admit of sort of flowing, fluid, intermixed, and multiple, plural, and other such iterations you can think about description of subjectivities. And it assumes then that this autonomous, written, linear, reasonable, secular, unitary subjectivity is everybody's subjectivity, that everybody thinks like that. So it doesn't admit of those plural and interconnected histories that I was just referring to. Now, of course, historians have protested against this, and therefore you have, of course, a large number of what you or we refer to as the histories of the marginalized, of the subalterns, of the minoritized, and so on and so forth. And tribal peoples form part of one such group, form part of this conspectus, as it were, of the subalterns. And the larger population of Kanke is what has been recognized historically as tribal or related. And that is where actually the problem comes. Because when I wanted to write a history of Kanke, I of course wanted to write the histories of these people. But since these people did not think of time in a way that conformed to the protocols of history, as in their time was not linear time, it was not time of an autonomous sort of unitary individual, it was not a time of the secular, it was definitely not the time of the reasonable, and their histories were not written. I found it difficult to write a history, a disciplinary history, or a history that would be accepted within the disciplinary formations where most of us historians work. And it's a huge and well-entrenched complex. What was available to me to write the history of Kanke, and which would have been admissible within the historical protocol, were of course the records of the colonial princely state of Kanke, colonial ethnologies of the peoples of this area, and interestingly, another set of documents, not quite here, not quite there, documents I've referred to as semi-archival documents. And I mentioned the type, Ikeranama, I'll come to that soon enough. But the primary two kinds of archives open to me were the first two, the records of the colonial princely state and colonial ethnologies, both of which either did not represent the communities that I am talking about at all, or in a way that did not give them agency within the making of their own lives, or referred to them in a way that placated and subordinated them to the vision of the modern state. So their histories were not really counted. So the records of the princely state performed the function of producing a relationship between an all-active, all-knowing, all-powerful state and supine, passive, completely non-agential subject populations. So there was this modern state trying to govern, to administer, to rule. And it did so quite easily because the other side of it, the subjects over whom it ruled, had no place, really, no function, no possibility of acting within that relationship. It was a simple system of rule and of being ruled. Colonial ethnologies wrote about these people, the tribal and the related peoples, but they thought of the lives of these people as consisting entirely of religious sensibilities, not sensibilities that could envision a world in the real sense of the term, not political sensibilities that allowed these kinds of envisions. They could think about their worlds, but they could not meaningfully think of who they were and what it is that they wanted, what I pointed out initially as vision or as envisioning. So the two primary kinds of archives I was looking at didn't quite provide me with the wherewithal to be able to write a history of the peoples of Kanke. There was a third document, the Semiarchival Ikeranama, which held interesting possibilities. It has never been properly filed or archived, and this was found actually in the trunks of the palace in Kanke, stashed away and put out of view, not properly organized and sequenced and filed in the official archive. So when I was looking at it, I found that these Ikerannamas were essentially undertakings by groups of villagers who promised to take an ancestral deity of the kind that I was talking about in the possession of the royal family of Kanke to their villages for purposes of what we would call government and administration. Now, in the records of the princely state, we do not come across the mention of any such activity. And one would understand why. And that is because these activities dealt with ancestral deities or spirits in the possession of the rulers of Kanke, who were trying to be modern and govern in a modern way and with the modern administration. How could they admit that they actually had spirits of their own, who they actually sent out to the villages to administer and govern the villages, when in the administrative records, they actually also admit that modern administration is not quite making the headway that it was supposed to. In fact, you often find the colonial government admonishing the princely state about how most of the policies that they were supposed to implement that fall within the idea of modern governmentality, not quite being implemented. And you wonder why that was happening until, of course, you come across these documents and you find that there was a parallel administration where the princely state was actually transacting in spirits and gods and administering people through these, but not admitting them in public and not really putting them out, putting this documentary evidence for it out in the public realm. So, there is mention of the people of Kanke and they seem to be active, but it is really not present in the main archive of the state of Kanke. So I wondered where else one might be able to get more information about it, because in these practices, the villages come alive. Names are mentioned of people, gods, deities, problems, this and that. They're not reduced as they are in the case of the archives of the state into statistics, data, dull descriptions and numbers and flat sort of, organizational details of this and that. The officialese sort of suddenly melts and dissipates into this thriving sort of throbbing world of activity and excitement, of thefts, of diseases, of misfortunes, of conflicts within the villages, or murders, of this, that. And here you find the administration actually getting its hand dirty in that way. But of course, through these ancestral spirits, which it will not own up to, and which it is silent about in its archives, and which are presented in the colonial ethnologies, but only as religion, at one remove from the political, nothing to do with the state or with the rulers, just beliefs that are carried on and practiced on the side. So here, what happens is that these practices come center stage, and they become the very stuff of politics. So when I said, where do I find this? The only choice for me then was to look at the practices of these deities, if they existed at this time, and they did, although they're fast dying out, and to try and read them, to kind of mine them for evidence of a political, of a vision, of a history of Kanke. And this is one view of it. In the lush green forest areas of Kanke, you have a person hoisting the ancestral deity up and is actually responding to a set of questions being asked by people sitting in front of him. They are not in view over here. And it is through this that they are trying to divine the causes for why it has not rained that particular year. So the very fundamentals of life, that is where these ancestor deities took me in some senses. And that is where I found really stuff that then I thought would comprise a proper history, as it were, of the peoples of Kanke. Now, mining alternate archives is something that has been done by many fellow scholars, and I have learned a lot from all of them. The way in which my work is different is that I am actually tipping over into the other side, which is that the question when we recover these other sort of voices, these are the terms in which we speak about them, when we recover these other voices, is how far can we really bring them into the domain of mainstream disciplinary history? God, spirit, unreason, as it were, non-linear time, ancestors and their descendants existing in the same place, the past and the present all mixed up, oral accounts, nothing written really, subjectivities of a kind where gods, human beings, spirits, communities move into each other, become this or that, and change, very protean sort of subjectivities, as it were. You can see that these are all violative of those protocols that I have pointed out, are so fundamental for the maintenance of the dominant disciplinary history that has become the kind of reigning historical exercise of our times. So how much of that can we bring? Can we maintain a language of intelligibility once we bring these things into focus? Or will all of this then dissipate into something that, and scatter into something we will never be able properly to understand in the language that is intelligible to us? Will we then be entering a realm whose language we do not sort of understand and which does not belong to our times? And here, of course, the tribal subaltern is perhaps a very, very complex subaltern. So, of course, all subalternity or marginalization has its own peculiar sort of aspects. But in the case of the tribal subaltern, there is a double trouble, which is that if history is a knowledge practice about time, then it is really the tribal, represented as the primitive, who provides that grid of movement from the past to the present to the future on which history's linear time is based. So the tribal is a true subaltern within historical exercise in a very formal and specific sense, in that the tribal actually is the prehistory of our society. The tribal has come to pass, and therefore we are. The tribal, even if the tribal exists in our time, is actually a vestige of a past we have left behind. So the task of recovering this figure within historical enterprise, disciplinary historical enterprise, is fraught, because you have to then deal with what is called unreason, with spirits, with gods, with time in all this mixed up way in which it appears in their accounts, with orality, which is very fluid and constantly sort of in flux, and so on and so forth, a variety of different kinds of things. So what historians usually do is to gesture to them, to gesture to these other words and bring them in conversation with our own, but not quite go the full way. What I have tried to do in this book, and that's where perhaps it is a little different from other books, and I don't know what really the full purchase of this is, because I might be going into a blind alley. Because after recovering this world of spirits and gods, what does one do with it? That is the question. So, but nevertheless, I have done it because I feel that the whole drive to make history in some senses more sustainable, that requires that we really give up our discomfort with this, because what modernity seems to have brought us to is a crisis of proportions, which require now imagining things really beyond what is given. And for that, of course, we have to imagine that which has never been imagined before, but also perhaps look at and delve into imaginations of the past that we have dismissed quite easily, especially since sometimes when we are talking about communities that, say, for questions of environment or ecology, have managed better than our own society. So, but we have very quickly passed them over because they don't quite sort of speak in the language that we do. And often, as I said, transact in things that we have given up. So, but these communities think of the world as sentient, of forests, rivers, and hills as sentient. Surely there is something there. They think of communities in ways that don't necessarily divide and categorize them as we do. So tribe, caste. These are two problems I deal with because my communities are neither sort of tribal communities nor caste communities. There are all kinds of other things in between, and they produce their own sense of community, which just goes beyond and is in excess of anything that we are used to understanding and classifying our world as. So what I've done really is to go, now here I'm using the word or the term non-modern in a very limited sort of a way, because modernity literally describes here and now, and that here and now is really truly very plural. It is very irreducible also, and it is hugely interconnected and inextricably entwined. But of course, we separate a certain modern as being a prior modern, and other kinds of here and now as non-modern. So in that sense, I'm using the term non-modern. And what this non-modern, what I'm doing then is to go into this non-modern. So what I've done is to, of course, not say that tribal worlds, and I'm not even saying these are tribal worlds. I'm saying these are tribe caste worlds, or worlds that need a different vocabulary to think them through and imagine them. These worlds are connected to our worlds. And we live, as Dipesh Chakravarti says, in many instances by principles that we often other and think as belonging only to them, but whose center of gravity actually lies away and apart from the historical protocols and the principles of historical protocols that I outlined. So it's a very different cosmos. The center of the cosmos is very different. Our kind of modern is part of that cosmos. It intersects, infiltrates, and engages with this cosmos. But the center of gravity, as I'm saying, it is very different. So when you read this book, I will try and move you to a very different language, and we'll start with things that we apprehend our world with, but we'll gradually give those up to use a very different set of words and terms where a different kind of world and cosmos will be brought to life and view. So that's one very important thing. And here, what then I find is that there are ways of envisioning the world. There are visions of the world which we need to take note of. These visions are not panaceas for our time. They don't resolve everything that we have, as problems of our time. In fact, some of these are things that we should just let be. But there are many other things that perhaps are instructive and might at least help us imagine sort of things beyond what we are used to, and beyond the disciplinary history and its political and its vision and its particular understanding of time, of past, present, and future. So I won't tell you exactly what that is, because I would love you to read that book. What kind of a political does this produce, this cosmos suggest? What kind of a world does it bring into view? What kind of state, or is there a state at all? What kind of polity? What kind of political? Pratap Banerjee's new book on the elementary aspects of the political is forcing many of us to rethink and deepen our investigation of the political. At the moment, I have not quite gone there. I haven't quite fully understood also what she's saying, but I'm in the process of doing it. But at the moment, I'm just putting it out there that the political might be, as I think she's also trying to say, be very different from what we think can be. A set that is all that we have and nothing beyond. Can we think of, envision other kinds of societies and other kinds of ways of being and other kinds of future? Then the second thing that this work does somewhat differently is on the question of voice. As you can see, fundamental to all this exercise will be this question of, can I speak for these people? I'm already thinking of myself as being us, with our modern, in that limited sense, way of thinking about the world, envisioning the world, and so on and so forth. Can I ever represent that voice, or the voices of those people? And here there is a twist in the tale. And this might actually be rather damning in the sense that this might further disqualify me from speaking about these people. But actually, I labor that point because I say that, where do I then put myself, really? And you will immediately see what I mean when I will tell you that I am from the old princely family of Kanke. And so when the communities of Kanke are talking about the king and about the state and so on and so forth in their accounts, and giving a very different account of it from how the state records will give or the ethnologies will give, they're actually talking about my ancestors. So when I was talking to them, they were talking to me about their ancestors and about my ancestors. And they and I were actually part of the story because it was our society that we were talking about. So as the king, do I have no right to write about these people? Who are, which is my community? Who are my people really? And they embraced me and they spoke to me about their and my ancestors as completely intermixed, separated also, but also hugely intermixed, just as I became part of their communities and their rituals and their practices because there was already a role for me there. There were so many things that would not happen without me. Or somebody from my family in my place. And so, I'm suggesting that, yes, of course, I am the villain of the piece in some ways. They will be writing and talking against me, against the king, my ancestors, as it were. But there is a different view of the polity that comes into place, not the same kind of king-subject relationship that we are used to, which is coming to us, I feel, from a certain set kind of past, that we actually have a variety of different kinds of experiences of rulership and subjecthood, or probably relationships that can't even be described always in terms of rulership and subjecthood. And the very set of terms that we use to speak about kings in the Indian subcontinent in South Asia are so many that each of those are probably clues to many, many different histories of relationships between what we would call rulers and subjects that can't really be exhausted in the simple understanding of rulers and subject as separated out, hermetically sealed off from each other, one ruling, the other passively accepting rule. Here, the vision that they produce is one in which they themselves become rulers. They pull the king out, drag the king out, and enmesh the king in relationships from which the king cannot escape, and which are of terms which do not belong to and are not determined by the king or the state or the colonial or the princely administration, etc. So, as Bakhtin argues, subjectivities are essentially interconnected, that we always live in intersubjective spaces. And that is a thing that I leverage here, that I cannot but be part of all this. and I will write about it because I am part of this. And I sometimes feel that this sort of hesitation in actually writing about and stepping back from it might not be part of a subconscious desire actually to continue to maintain these barriers, as it were. If historically we have thought of two entities as being oppositional, the way out of the situation now is not a politics, as I would say, of revenge, but a politics of conversation. And I enact multiple subjectivities as a teacher at St. Stephen's and Delhi University, as a member of the royal family in Kanke, as this, as that, so many different things, as part of the cosmos that they construct for me and for the world to see, in which I'm hardly the king that I claim, or my family claims that they were. So there are so many things going on there that don't quite register when we work with the kind of standards, with languages, with tropes, with paradigms and principles that we have too often and easily taken for granted. So that is the book, really, in some senses. It does many other things too, but I will leave it there and leave you to read the book and to find out more about it. And perhaps we can have a larger, more deeper conversation there. So apologies again for that small hiccup at the beginning, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Aditya. That was fascinating. I'm sure we're going to have plenty of questions. I was just wanting to ask you, you said you were not going to talk about what kind of polity it was, what kind of politics this was, and we would have to read the book, but would you share a little bit with us? I'm very curious. Tell us a little bit. You sort of enticed us in, and I would just love to hear a little bit about that.
Yes.
Just a sort of teaser, a preview, before we all have the chance to read the book.
Right. So let me just quickly, if you will allow, read from the book, and if that is all right.
Sure, please.
So, right. So here it is. This is from a section called the Afterword, which is actually an afterword because my copy editor suggested that I drop it completely. And you will see that I'm attempting something rather fantastic and probably problematic in a politically correct sort of world. But nevertheless, I said, fine, I will. And so instead of epilogue, we converted this into an afterword. So I write, the archive of the colonial princely state of Kanke produces its polity as a historical one, very much in the language of power of mainstream disciplinary history, which works along a singular, unitary, secular, rational, statist, and progressivist sense of time, critical to the narratives of civilization and development. Within this absolutely synchronized temporality of state and history is structured a polity which is unicentric, vertical, dichotomous, fixed, and closed, where political power, authority, and sovereignty, or in other words, political capacity, are vested in the state and legitimated by its history. When the ancestral accounts, anchored in their own language of power, transgress the temporal protocol of history, they articulate the idea of a polity that is pluricentric, horizontal, non-dichotomous, fluid, and open in comparison to that of the state, where political power, authority, and sovereignty are divided, contested, and shared between the Raja and the state, and the Bhumka, or the people, and its ancestral forces in pursuit of the balance of the land, which is always a work in progress. The ancestral polity is pluricentric. The regimes of the Raja and that of the many clan heads and other ancestral and non-ancestral forces of the land comprise multiple foci of power, giving rise to a political landscape of many distinct sometimes competing and sometimes collaborating centers located in the communities and the cosmos of the land. The unicentric claim of the Raja's state are contested and broken up quite emphatically in this vision. The various centers of power and their relationship with each other are also considerably differentiated in terms of the tone and texture of negotiations they comprise, in distinction to the uniform sway attempted and claimed by the Raja's regime. This polity is also horizontal, constituted through a field of forces where neither the Raja and state nor the communities and their land have a clear superiority over the other. The vertical unidirectional flow of power from the state to the subjects is fundamentally disrupted and dispersed by the idea of the balance of the land. The ancestral political system is also not dichotomous. The boundaries between the entities, Raja, state, ruler, and the communities and their land are porous, and the regimes they create overlap with each other so that the subjectivities are not exclusive, but as they should be, that is, interrelational. This relationship is premised on a state of things in which the Raja, his ancestors, the ancestral deities, the land constitute a continuum of being and experience that cuts across the conception of discrete domains of rulership and subjecthood created by the state's idea of equality. The local polity in the ancestral accounts is also more fluid and ever improvised, and has unpredictable outcomes in the interaction between the Raja state, the ancestral centers, and the land. This is in sharp contrast to the fixed pre-given regimes of routine and regulation, as in the case of the state. No force is infallible, no arrangement undoable. Constant reconfiguration is the operating principle, with the balance and union of forces being as precarious as they are desired.
Thank you. I will read fully. Thank you. It's really fascinating. I could ask more, but I want to hand it over to other people. We've got quite a few questions now. Akhil Gupta has a question, but perhaps we should start with one of our audience. Shrikant Chandan, can you see in the Q&A? Perhaps I will just read it out. The Ikeranama shows the people with agency enjoying a thriving relation with the king, unlike the state archives. I wonder about the dual lines of the kings of Kanke, who negotiated between the two worlds of colonial modernity and the rich underworld of their people and spirit. In what ways such negotiations change the quotidian practices of the kings or princely states?
Yeah, interesting, Shrikant, and thank you for that question. True. And what I would say is that when I think about my grandfather, he seems on the one hand to have been modernizing the state and its apparatuses and administrations and personnel and policies in a way that had not been seen before. All this while the colonial government had been complaining that Kanke was not quite implementing the forest policy, not doing this, not doing that. Suddenly you have this young ruler who comes into the majority. He ruled for most of his time as a minor ruler in 1943-44, just a few years before he had to give up power. And he launches many important policies for a complete overhaul of administration. Modern hospitals, modern veterinary centers, schools, colleges, agrarian exhibitions, grain banks, new technology for farming, etc. All kinds of things that you would consider the hallmark of a modern administration. And at the same time, when I visited these villages and talked to these people, my interlocutors, they would speak about how he would come hunting. And they had stories. For example, in one village, there was a story of how he killed a man-eating tiger, on account of which the villagers had been suffering for a long time. And a local set of leaders, and he collaborated to kill the tiger. And then the tiger was paraded around the village with a coin representing the king's administration kept on top of the tiger's body. And many other such sort of stories, like one where he was called for a rain divination sort of conversation, where the king and the communities joined together to ask the ancestors why it was not raining and what the future would be like. And while he was there, they say that it started raining so heavily that the elephant that he had actually ridden into the village in, or had rode the elephant into the village across the river, now couldn't cross the river back to the other side because the river was suddenly split because of the flash flood caused by incessant rain started immediately after this rain divination conversation. So, he seems to have been present in both these worlds, and quite easily so, without there being any sort of, anything that would show discomfort or difficulty of aligning or of getting these worlds together. So I don't know, probably, but something like this might suggest, what might have been happening at that time.
Now we have another question from Ananya Chakrabarti. Can you see this, Aditya? Perhaps
Yes.
you would like to read it out rather than me.
Right. Thank you, Ananya. It's fascinating. Under modernity, which rejects and renders obsolete the other non-modern worlds, how far can we push our limits? Are you not falling into the same kind of words and vocabularies which you choose to critique when you put the modern world as a referential plane to talk about the non-modern tribal world? How far are we able to transcend the boundary of disciplinary history? So yes, Ananya, there is a problem there that I can't quite, in the sense that I start out with this language, I return again to this language, and my book is meant for you, it is meant for my colleagues, my students, scholars across the world, working within this academia, this space that we call our own. And so, of course, I am tied to that, and I can't quite escape it. But the point is that I'm saying that there is this division that we are actually creating between this world and that world is what I feel does not quite emerge in these accounts, which are so closely entwined with what we would understand as our worlds. So a British official, a kind of a rifle shooting competition, coexist with miracles, with magic, with ancestral deities. And they don't feel the need to pit these against each other. So I think what I'm trying to do in at least most of the chapters in between is take you into that world where the distinctions between these kinds of worlds are actually sort of broken down. And I'm not saying that they lose all sense of their particular sensibilities, but these sensibilities are always interrelational. So I use the word intertemporality. I'm not sure whether that works, but a kind of that we're always already in the interstice in some senses.
I think we should go to Akhil Gupta's question now. Akhil.
Thank you, Aditya. That was a really interesting talk. I'm actually building on Ananya's question, and my question had to do with the incommensurabilities between indigenous knowledges and state knowledges. And since you didn't really tell us much about the substance of these knowledges, I would be interested in knowing if you thought that there were moments when they were simply such different logics that informed them that they were not able to be translatable in the way in which you say people were able to coexist within these two worlds, right? So not as resistance, but as moments of disjuncture, or moments where they were simply like you couldn't cross over from one type of logic to the other, instead of blending them together in some contradictory fashion. So I wonder if you can think of examples of that, or would that even be something that would make sense in the way in which you're thinking about these questions?
Right. Thank you. Okay. Very good question. And I have dealt with this, fairly continuously throughout the book. So let me take one example of communities, like what we think of communities. So typically I would have gone in thinking about the tribal community. And then I found in the middle of all that there were large numbers of what we would call other backward caste peoples, living intermixed in ways that at least in many and the majority instances of these ancestral deity practices, which are actually Gond ancestral deities, tribal ancestral deities, did not really, stand as two separate communities, so that I could just speak about a tribal community, or, awkwardly speak about some OBC groups coming in at certain points of time as a token sort of gesture, or as token sort of aspects. But then as I kind of heard them further, I heard about the Bhumkal, which is the people of the land. And that idea of the Bhumkal seemed not to recognize these caste and tribe and other possible classificatory community descriptions that I had at my disposal. But once in a while, I would come across experiences that were obtrusive within that seemingly sort of easily held idea of the Bhumkal, or the people of the land, which is like, for example, this region has recently seen mobilization and polarization also on account of that, on caste and tribal lines. On tribal lines, both along, of course, narratives of indigeneity, Adivasi rights, and so on and so forth. And of course, on the other side, the Vanavasi Hindus and so on and so forth on the other side, which we are familiar with now very much. And similarly, there is also mobilization of other backward castes, because there is a possibility and a demand that the sixth schedule be implemented in this area. So if you look at the population of the old princely state of Kanke, tribals are a minority, and the other backward castes are a majority. But adding parts of the northern parts of the erstwhile Bastar state, the new district has a majority tribal population. So that becomes the basis for asking for the implementation of the sixth schedule. So in response to that and reaction to that, there is considerable OBC mobilization now. So the Dashera event, which would otherwise be done by the Bhumkal, now in many places I see gets divided into 2 or 3 kinds of Dashera, one being done by this group, another by that group, and so on and so forth, organized along these modern sort of lines. And so there is a lot of tension. And thrown into the mix are these migrant Bengali communities that were relocated into this region after the Bangladesh war. And so there are debates in the Shera about the worship of Durga and the demonization of Mahishasura, which in this largely tribal area acquires a very different kind of problematic sort of overtone. So that comes into the mix as well. So modern day governmentality and emerging classificatory sort of descriptions from there seem to be impinging on my kind of understanding of which I feel is actually the traditional way in which they have imagined themselves as community, at least in relation to the king. So what I would say is that perhaps there are many different ways of being community. And the Bhumkal is one of them. And probably historically must have been or would have had greater purchase or salience. But now, of course, its stock is kind of plummeting. And, so that's one example, if I have attended to some of what you said.
So back to our Q&A, we have a question from Manish Prabhat. Can you see this?
Yes. Since you are talking of tribe castes, we understand that there were tribes which interacting with Hindu practices over time became tribe caste. In that context, what does the ancestral deity fit in the hierarchy of Hindu deities? And again, very interesting and an important question, and I deal with it substantially. So what I'm doing is not quite starting with that idea of the tribe caste continuum, which has been written about in works from the time of people like Surajit Sinha, all the way down to Srinivas and beyond, and so on and so forth. So what I'm doing is that rather than already in some senses marking out something as Hindu or tribal, what I'm describing is what seems to be a very complex set of practices coming from what we would now understand as Hindu and tribe. And I'm taking that mixture as a kind of organic, sort of integrated, cohering sort of complex in its own right, which does not make these distinctions and not necessarily looks for an originary kind of point of reference, whether it is Hindu or tribe. Because I'm also, to some extent, therefore, questioning the idea of the Hindu and of the tribe. What I'm saying is there are a variety of different kinds of very, very mixed, from our point of view, practices, experiences, references, figures, etc., that we or other centralizing narratives and power complexes have sought to simplify into the Hindu and the tribal or other things. But it is possible to not see them as always having to be referenced like that, because they don't seem to be working along those lines.
And next question, Sita Mamidipuri.
Right. Thank you, Manish, for that question. Sita, to your question, I'll try and read it. Anthropologists and historians who have worked with other tribal subaltern oral histories also find non-linearity of time as a very distinctive feature of tribal histories, but they usually also find a kind of logic that underlies that non-linearity. Ajaskaria, for instance, writes about Bhil histories and finds that two epochs of Mandini and Mongolai, which are defined by freedom and oppression, they are chronological in the sense that they are pre and during colonialism, or sometimes even refer to post-colonial Indian government as the oppressor and freedom as its opposite. Shail Mayaram, who works with Mio communities, finds a similar anti-imperial Mughal and colonial sovereignty as a logic of narrative time. Do you think there is a kind of logic here too for the non-linearity of time in recording and retelling histories? Also, do you think your own positionality in the community might give you access to narratives of sovereignty that might not otherwise be accessed? Thank you so much, Sita, for that. Yes, I'm familiar with both Skaria and Mayaram's work. And have I thought about non-linearity? Actually, now that you ask, and I should have thought of it more deeply and substantially before, I don't, except that I flag it at the beginning as saying that in historical time, in disciplinary historical time, this non-linearity would not work as something that I could write with, or I could write a history with. But I'm nevertheless going to do that, even though time does not always occur in a linear way. But after that, I abandoned that question of linearity and non-linearity, and don't quite think of it in terms of these things that Scalia and Mayaram seem to have suggested as possible templates at all. And I do actually get troubled by the question of chronology at one point of time, when I am saying that I'm going to focus on the colonial princely state. So somebody had actually asked me how, if I was actually talking about nonlinear time, I would still want to stick with some idea of the colonial princely. And so I say that, well, I'm using the colonial princely as a kind of holding point, not really something that I seriously, which I find seriously taken up in these accounts. So they often spoke to me as if they were speaking to my ancestors, just as they sometimes spoke to me as their ancestors would speak to me and my ancestors. So my past and my present and their past and their present got mixed up in ways that were so. Somebody was talking to me about how in one journey that he had been going on, he saw a leopard. And then there was this point where he had to engage with the leopard. Then suddenly he started talking about his ancestor and the leopard. And so I stopped him there and said, so was it you or was it your ancestor? They said, oh, okay. So he came back to himself. But then again, at several other points, he would lapse into his ancestor. And I found that when I was talking to them about various things, once I had got a fairly substantial store of these accounts, is that I too began to often reference my ancestors almost subconsciously, unconsciously, as myself, as something that I wanted to ask, or I wanted myself represented as. So there were interesting things happening during that time. And so this question of time, I'm just using this concept of time without any rubrics. What I'm saying that is that there are many kinds of time. We might choose and pick out certain kinds of times or temporalities within this mix that we might call colonial or post-colonial or this or that. But I'm not going to be doing it. For me, it is the time of the spirit, it is the time of the Angrez, it is the time of the Raja of the state, as well as the spirit and the God. And those are the times that, so in some ways, what I've done is I've displaced that colonial, post-colonial, except I thought I could end with some accounts about the ancestral deities and the post-colonial state. At that time, what I found is that there was considerable recognition of, and in fact, acute sort of sense of this and that, of times that were forcing themselves into fixity and into concreteness and into definition, and in a way that was being very awkwardly felt and not quite being well dealt by them at all. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I did go somewhere with it, I think. And about, oh yeah, I think so many times I found themselves asserting things against previous Rajas or against me. And I think I brought that on. You see, they were quite firm about making points about their relationship with the Raja, one in which their regimes prevailed, their sort of cosmic principles were sort of in some senses weighing the balance or tilting the balance on that side. So I think, yeah, my position played a very important part. Of course, I must have inflected their accounts and their narratives in many different ways, which somebody else who might do an ethnography there might experience very, very differently. So I probably lost all that. But what can I do? What I'm saying is that I'm just giving you one moment, one perspective. And what I do say is that there is plurality of ways of looking at things, which we must bring into view for whatever purposes. Thank you.
Now we have a question from Aditya Rao.
Yes. Sorry. Thank you. Aditya, how much of the worldviews that were constructed by indigenous people centuries ago can still be said to be well understood by the modern day descendants of those cultures? In other words, how do the influences of the modern world muddy the waters and lead to a misunderstanding of both what was originally intended, as well as of how these practices should be understood within the context of the modern living? So thanks for that, Aditya. I am actually not working with the categories indigenous and related sort of values. And I'm trying to kind of displace also the binary of modern and pre-modern. And so in some ways, what I'm again saying is that our experience of time is always plural and intertwined quite inextricably. And we can't always reduce things to what and how we actually do reduce them to, or reduce them. And that we must actually understand and recognize these flows, as it were, these interstices where where actually everything in some senses always happens, kind of polyglossia, as if I may use that word from Bakhtin, kind of very, very heterogeneous field of forces where it is very difficult to separate out the modern, the pre-modern, the Hindu and the tribal and the Sanskritic and the indigenous, this or that. Can there be other kinds of subjectivities that do not fall into these traps, is my question really. And so it is always muddy. What I'm saying is that it's not a question of how do they muddy the waters? We always live, from our rather restrictive point of view, in a very muddy and messy place. And we think of it as messy because we've separated out ourselves purely and sublimated ourselves out categories and this and that. So this mess is life in some senses. It is extremely messy. And that is I think, the normal condition of being. Can I take the next one? Seth.
Please do, yes.
Yeah, Seth. To what extent would you say the outlook and approach of your own personality has formed as a result of your shared past with the people of Kanke? And has there been a significant point in your life which changed the way you perceived the situation initially? Yeah, there is in fact a long early chapter, which is called The King as I, which goes into the details of this set of dilemmas that I experienced, and how it took me a long time to come to terms with what I was doing and what I found in the field, or what I was seeing in the field. And it was not at all easy in some senses. And I feel that, I have changed considerably as a result of that. And that is precisely what I think also this point about voice is about. That the conceit of the ethnographer as somebody who might tamper with and spoil the pure is a huge problem, because that this allows you from going in there and getting your hands dirty. And that is when you will find what you will find, really, in some sense. So, I use my position very, very forcefully, without shying away from that at all, showing all the complexities and the many different worlds that I think everybody else inhabits, and how we constantly reduce them to just one standard or just one place or positionality or subjectivity. And so there is a lot going on there, and I would love you to read it and to tell me if you think I have managed to, reconcile myself to some of the discomfort, as you would well understand I would have felt in actually doing this project and in being who I was, and so on and so forth. So, but I think I'm many different people. I also get transformed in the process. So am I an insider? Am I an outsider? Am I an outsider who's trying to be an insider? Am I an insider who had become an outsider but is coming back home? Who am I really? Who are all of us in some senses? And I think the answer lies in finding that there are always all these ties that we have to almost all kinds of things, and we just kind of pull ourselves into our boxes and then jump over each other.
Just go on to the next question, Aditya. There are a lot of questions. They seem to be sort of growing as fast as you're answering them. So we might, I think we will probably have to draw a line under the questions fairly soon. And Aditya, maybe you're able to be a little bit faster with these remaining ones, just so we could get through them, if that's possible. Though, sorry.
So this is G. Taylor. Thank you so much for your question. Who were the authors of the Ikeranama? What language is it written in? And are there elements of the story you're discovering the trunk that you would care to share? Yeah, okay. So the Ikeranamas are written by a category of judicial officials called Vakya Navis. These were sort of scribes, basically judicial scribes, attendant on a judicial court. There would be a set of small workers, like a notary and scribe who would know the language of doing it. So this is written in Hindustani and in the Devanagari. And yes, so this practice of sending the deities under the control of the royal family to the villages for solving the problems of the villages, everything from, as I said, from theft to illnesses, to famine and drought, to conflicts, etc., everything that comprised the stuff of life. So this practice of sending the ancestral deities under the control or in the possession of the royal family to the villages has continued till date. In fact, the other day we got a request for that once again. And so at that time, of course, the Ikeranama was basically something that the colonial princely state was getting these people to write out and attest in order to sanitize its own sort of transactions with, I feel, the supernatural. Because you see, the colonial officials were sitting over their heads and telling them that they should reduce involvement in these things. But they knew how the villages functioned and how so much of their position actually depended on that. And so, this was, I think, a way of legitimating a practice which otherwise would have been quite difficult to accept by the modernizing colonial officials who were always giving these tutorials to them about how they were not quite doing what they wanted to. And now it is a different thing. We are not the state at all, as in my family is not the state. We are not the rulers. So this is actually a document of agreement between us and the people who take the deity to their villages or to their homes, where we ask them not to do anything that breaks the law. So it's a different thing altogether. And I found lots of trunks in the attic, like it would be, in so typically the case, stashed away somewhere, lots and lots of these. I wasn't able to read all of them. I've read some, but I have sort of digitized most of those. Very interesting. And I could write reams and reams about just those things, about all kinds of things they deal with. There's one point where they write about what is to be done in case they have found a witch in the village. That opens a whole new question about witches. Recently, there's been this lovely book by Helen MacDonald about witchcraft accusations in Chhattisgarh. And she writes about how witchcraft accusations are actually more numerous in Chhattisgarh than elsewhere. So these pose important questions for my kind of work. It's one thing for me to set this up as a kind of alternate vision of the state and polity. Another thing to actually see the power dynamics operating in witch hunts and accusations of witchcraft, etc. A whole different terrain itself. So all kinds of things are there. These are actually treasure troves. Literally, they are treasure troves of things that one can. So sorry, Anna, I took longer than I should have.
No worries, not easy. So I think we should probably aim to wrap up in five minutes and let you go, Aditya, because it's the middle of the night. But so we have 3 more questions, because one we've had already.
So Avinash, since quite a bit of your research would rely on interaction with members of the community, often via the interlocutors, to what extent would their conception of relationship between the community and the state in the modern sense influence their perception about the past that you have been trying to unwrap? To what extent would their conception of the relationship between the community and the state in the modern sense? So I didn't quite understand that. So perhaps I could talk to you separately about this,
Maybe just go on, and yes, perhaps Avinash, you could always email Aditya.
Yeah. Then Seth,
that one we've had.
Seth, I think
it came up again for some reason.
Suchintans, you mentioned the ambivalence and fluidity of the polity in Kanke vis-a-vis the colonial state and the Bhumkal. How was the emergence of the post-colonial state of India negotiated within this polity? In other words, who were the stakeholders in the process of integration of the princely state of Kanke to the Republic of India? Not sure if it falls within your framework. So in other words, who were the stakeholders in the process of integration? So my grandfather, who was the last ruler of Kanke, was a nationalist. All his friends were Congress leaders in the central provinces, like also the later President of India, S.D. Sharma, who was a close friend of his. And my grandfather is supposed to have been one of the first to have signed the instrument of accession, especially in the light of the fact, this becomes important in the light of the fact that the ruler of the neighboring state of Bastar was taking much longer. Bastar is contiguous with Hyderabad. And so something from there was rubbing off onto Bastar. And there's, of course, a whole history of Bastar and states, colonial and post-colonial, that you must be familiar with. So my grandfather was he acted with great alacrity. I've seen a document signed by him for the people of Kanke, where he says that he's merging Kanke into the Union of India because he feels that this is the best course for them and that they must not resist in any way. And they must accept his decision because it is for everybody's betterment. And he then went on to participate in the elections following the merger. And he was twice MLA from Kanke, and his sister was MLA once. And he continued to perform his role. I think later on he got a little dejected But so he was, I think, the primary stakeholder in some senses. There was a group of nationalist leaders, local leaders around him whom he had groomed and nurtured. And he had introduced limited representation in the local government in the Kanke town. So again, one of the first instances of local representative government in central India. And so he was very much of that mindset and the group of people. So after the seat in Kanke became reserved for elections, those that he had groomed became the people who fought elections and won for a long time. So there was a whole group of people who were nationalist and formed a circle around him, and who were also connected to the anti-imperial struggle at the center with the Indian National Congress especially, and then who would have been sort of interested in and invested in the merger. But there is very interesting, there's a section that I have put in about how the ancestral deity practices take a rather gloomy view in their interaction with the post-colonial government, because that government is not as accepting of the principles through which their cosmos works. So one of these ancestral deities was actually put behind bars. He was jailed for disturbing public peace. So it's very interesting. Yeah. So sorry, Saif, since we are short of time, we will talk later, and I will definitely talk to you about the question that you've asked, and Avinash also, definitely. Just one last question by Richan. What are the present-day practices associated with Angadeo? What is the importance and the context of Angadeo in present-day tribal communities? Do they view it as divine power? So, in some ways, many aspects of the practice are being reinvented around new references, as it were, derived out of the post-colonial state and its processes and practices. There are a few that remain that still are tethered to the old colonial princely state. So the Dashera and the annual fair events, for example. And so in some ways, the Angadev practices are somewhere in between, of either being reworked into interesting new forms and substances, aligned to and directed towards the requirements of the present day, and a kind of memory of the past. I think strategically, in order to keep alternative points of reference as goal. So in the Dashera celebration that is centered around the old princely family, like our family, I feel that they often raise questions about how modern state apparatus are not responsive to their daily requirements and their demands. So, there is that interplay. There's the dynamic that is being set in place. But a lot of the form in which these practices exist probably dying out. And I don't think anybody has because these communities are also fast transform. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aditya, for a really fantastic talk. I just started your book, and I'm definitely going to read it, and I'm sure many of us who've listened to this talk as well. And thank you for fielding so many questions as well. And it sounds like you got, the material for several more books. We look forward to, yeah.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm really grateful for everybody who attended and stayed back. And thank you, Jamaica and Akhil as well, and everybody at UCLA. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Good night and good morning.
Good night. Bye-bye.